Keizer Planning Commission to order and go for approval of actually 3 sets of minutes. We could do them either individually or collectively. Let's start with May the 9th. Motion to approve?
I motion to approve all of them.
Second?
I'll second that.
Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. Okay, appearance of interested citizens. We have 2 citizens. Okay. All right. Then we have public hearing, and we're going to group these together. So the public hearing will be on the Development Code, Section 1.20 definitions, Section 2.315 development standards, Section 3.101 summary of application types, and Section 3.202 general procedures type 1, 2, and 3 actions. So let's go ahead and open that up.
All
Sharon?
right. Thank you, Planning Commissioners. Mr. Whalen. It's good to see you behind the mic. So tonight we have the 4 sections we're bringing. There's really only one that has changes of substance. The other 4, the definitions section, we're simply moving some language from 2.315 into the definitions. There's no actual change to the language. It literally is just moving to live in a more appropriate place. And the section 3.101 and 3.202, they are specifically being changed because of the necessity to include the changes we proposed from the substance to get them in our chart and to name them correctly. If you remember, I think most of you were here, we did a design review, an alternative design review for the proposed theater in Area B of Keizer Station. And there was some ambiguity that was found when we went through that we didn't really call out a process, exactly where it should live in the development code and who should hear it and all of those kinds of things. So that's one of the changes we're making tonight in 2.315. So in your packets, if you want to kind of follow along, I was just going to walk through the changes in section 2.315 for you guys. And then if you have questions as we go, feel free to interrupt me. I have 5 kids at home. I constantly get interrupted, so it doesn't bother me at all. So in 2.315, if you guys are ready, yes, head nods, Kyle's on board, okay. So as we kind of go through the development standards section, on the first page, it's just literally grammatics. It's changing some things, nothing of any consequence. On page 2, we have just the added word under F of commercial. And on your desks today, I gave you a little 2-page sheet. There's just 2 pages. And this will be the first, oops, Shane screwed up, moment for us. So this represents a little change that I'd like to recommend as a proposed change to what I sent you. Because after we sent it all out, it was literally on Friday. I was going back over notes, kind of prepping for tonight, and I realized that there was kind of we caught something that we didn't intend to catch, and that was with this accessory structures of less than 500 square feet language. So we had added commercial. Forget about that. What we'd really like to do is just strike out that exemption altogether. The reason being is that in the development code, when people build accessory structures, residential accessory structures and commercial accessory structures or accessory structures for multifamily development, there's a standalone section in our code that regulates accessory structures. So these development standards like 50% ground floor windows, pedestrian connections, all of these, they don't ever apply anyway. But there's a page later on that we'll get to on page 8, which is the second page. They always apply to things like trash enclosures and small buildings. And so with this exemption, the way it's been written, could have been argued that, oh, my trash enclosure is not over 500 square feet. I don't have to paint it the same as my building. I don't have to have it be of a material that's similar to my building. That we don't want. So this little 2-page handout would be kind of insert the page 2, so F would be just fully struck now. And then when we get to page 8, I'll explain that a little bit better because we'd propose some additional language that I no longer want to propose. Does that make sense? Sorry about the confusion. My bad. So in D, at the bottom of page 2, this is kind of our first substantive change for this section of code. This is where there was some confusion as to process, type, and what a development standards alternative versus development review versus design review, what and how it worked. So what we've proposed is we propose some language to clarify the fact that we want this, if a business comes in and they get a building permit and they meet our design standards in the zone the building sits in and these additional standards in 2.315 and it complies, that just happens in conjunction with a building permit. That's what we've always kind of done. If they want to do something different, the way they would do that would be what we did when the theater came in and said, we can't put all these windows along the street because it's a movie theater. They would go through this alternative design, what did we call it? Okay, development standards alternative application process that now lives in the development code and says it's a type 2B procedure. We give out notice, we go through the process, and the planning commission is the deciding body on whether or not we want to approve an alternative to these design reviews along commercial or anywhere else, or along, you know, the commercial corridor. The one exception is in Keizer Station with an approved master plan. The Keizer Station plan document itself specifically calls out alternative design reviews to be done by council. So that's the language we've proposed at the bottom of page 2 to just clarify that once and for all. We've had people over the years wondering, well, how do I do development review? Do I go to planning commission? Do I do this? Do I do that? So this kind of puts that to rest, and me included. So that kind of fixes that. Moving on, unless you guys have questions on that, moving on page 3, there's some changes to the text. Basically with the connection required, we chose to strike out the language and kind of rewrite it a little bit, and we feel it just simplifies it. The point being is we want the pedestrian circulation system to connect to the surrounding street and proposed transit uses and things like that. We don't want there to be a limit or a cap on a certain kind of distance. We want facilities to be connected. Let's see. Yes, sir.
Not something that you had marked, but I just had a question on number 4. You have driveway crossings shall be a maximum of 36 feet in width. Is there any chance of having that reduced in size?
For the maximum?
Well, for basically the driveway opening, having that reduced, limited to a size smaller than that.
So I mean, I guess this would be more of an on-site, a private on-site kind of requirement. The driveway, as in where it hits the public street, we have design standards that the Public Works Department has that kind of clarify what those would be. So I wouldn't feel great about messing with their design standards. But I mean, I guess the answer is yeah, I think it would be possible. You could reduce that number.
Okay, because if this is, or is this just talking about a crossing regardless of the width of the driveway cut? Is that
right? Yeah, it's not connected to the driveway width itself. So I mean, I think the intent here is where, because this is all under the pedestrian circulation system, the intent is if you have a large parking lot and a vast expanse of area that vehicles are driving, that if a pedestrian's going across those vehicular areas, it's not to be more than 36 feet wide for them to get across that area. That's how I read it to mean.
And I don't know, maybe Nate was going to say this, but my guess is that's for, if you think of, I don't know, the Ware Mart or the Schoolhouse Square, that's 3 lanes, a left turn, an in lane, and then a right lane, right only, and then out. So 3 lanes wide, I think, is the reason they got to 36. I'm guessing. But
So, oh, go ahead.
So this, we've always taken as internal because the street standards govern the actual entrance off of the public street. So the short answer is we could reduce that. My concern is we haven't really, that wasn't really on our radar to reduce. So I'm reluctant to bring up changes that we have not figured out what the unintended consequences are. I think the reality is, I understand what you're saying, and certainly it's safer for pedestrians if they have less width to cross in an internal driveway situation. So I would think that that may be something that could be looked at.
Okay. Well, as Nate alluded to, it's more of a safety factor. And obviously, the longer, even in a parking lot, people aren't always paying attention, and you've got, especially towards the entrances of buildings, you've got a lot of pedestrians walking back. So I thought the narrower the distance, the safer.
And particularly since there are generally very few traffic controls in these situations. So
Is that something that, since obviously staff would like to see this move forward to council, if the majority of us would be in support of asking the question that Mike is to Public Works, could we just maybe pull that one section out, subject to a review by Public Works Director? We have to do this as a complete.
remember, this is a recommending body, and so if you felt that that was an issue that you wanted to address, we would then have time as we process the staff report to go to council to actually do a little bit more analysis to see how many situations do we have like this and what might that unintended consequence be. If you're comfortable with saying, sure, that's something that we would like to address, certainly we have 2 council representatives here tonight. I would think that there's time enough for us to do that analysis. So,
Could I just take a straw poll of the Planning Commission, see if there's any thoughts of addressing this or reviewing it in terms of safety, and is at the same time, if it is like Shannon was saying, you got left turn, right turn, and entry, maybe that's a safety benefit versus the shrinking of the width of the walkway. Go
Well,
ahead.
and I think the other concern I would generally express on this is the 36 probably takes into account emergency services and access for those types of scenarios, and so I'd be a little bit reluctant to want to do that without talking with the fire district as well.
on first blush, if Shane and I were just talking about that, typically you have a fire lane, but I'm not sure that I would count that as a driveway.
Right.
That's a special designated purpose in the asphalt. So my first blush was, I wouldn't say that was part of the driveway. That's part of something else.
I think in the scenario I'm playing out in my head, if you approach North River Road and you're going towards Wearmart in that specific area I think you're talking about, just north of where the old Blockbuster used to be, that entrance there, you do have the one entrance into that area there at Creekside, but I think if you reduce that and basically only have, the turn left or right or whatever, and then an entrance, you're severely limiting the access point. I think at that point for emergency services, you wouldn't have a fire lane, I don't think.
No, but again, that driveway is controlled by the street standards. And in fact, other than the sidewalk, I would not encourage pedestrian crossings at that location.
Right.
So what this is talking about is pedestrian crossings and internal. And so, again, I'm thinking out loud here. I would not want a pedestrian crossing anywhere within that 3-lane section of traffic maneuvering to turn, that sort of thing. I would want them to provide a different kind of pedestrian circulation than crossing right there. So take it back and cross someplace else.
So for the audience and me, because I'm not understanding what you're saying, when you say internally, are you talking about within the parking area then? Okay.
Yeah.
Not coming off of the main,
Right.
main drag anywhere, it's
Well,
within
again, all of this is just free flow stuff. But technically, that would be counted as part of our review. And I would say if somebody had to cross, 10 feet off of the sidewalk, I'd say, time out, folks. You got to find a better way to get pedestrian circulation through your site. Because we know that's a conflict. And that section is where cars are jockeying and shifting and merging, and you definitely don't want to add pedestrians into that mix. So I think that might even be able to give us a tool to say, no, figure something else out, kind of thing.
Any other thoughts, comments? Michael?
The only other option I thought was where there are main crossings to have, if you can't narrow it, maybe have a minor island.
Break it up.
Yeah.
Well,
Again, just so I make sure we're talking about the same thing, are you talking about, like what Matt was talking about, entering into Ware Mart at the River Road location, or over at Schoolhouse Square when you're on River Road, or Shamawa Road, where they both have the 3 lanes?
See, that's how I
Internal
envisioned it.
Okay,
Originally, that's how I envisioned it. But from what you're saying, it sounds like internally, away from the sidewalk, any pedestrian crossing. Is that correct?
Yes, I mean, so public sidewalks that are going to be in the public right-of-way are going to be governed by either public improvement permits with street improvements or through a driveway and sidewalk permit issued by the Public Works Department. So they have their own set of design standards, and, it's built to a certain width. It's got to meet ADA grades and ramps and everything else. For what we're talking about here specifically, the kind of the modifying language here for driveway crossings, the intent of it is to say, hey, where we're moving pedestrians across to that public system really is where they're going to be going, or internally to the building, we want those delineated so people aren't just walking across asphalt, but rather across a parking area that's either raised and a different material, so standardized sidewalks or something stamped, or the stippled striping, something along those lines. So I definitely wouldn't approve a driveway location or materials and textures without the Public Works Director being the one to really approve those.
Okay, I think then.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, so
Michael, did you have a number in mind, a width in mind that you thought was more appropriate than that 36?
certainly originally when I was thinking of it as the curb cut entrance, I was, thinking 10-foot lane.
So like a lane width?
Yeah.
Okay.
But,
1 lane? You mean
10-foot lanes.
Per lane.
Per lane, so per direction, 10 foot rather than,
rather than
36
12.
would become 30,
yeah.
so,
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
okay?
oh,
But if we're not talking about curb cut entrance way, that's
okay,
different.
just something to think about. Our standard driveway width is 24 feet.
Okay.
So, and again, we're talking internal, we're talking pedestrian circulation internal to the site. And I would think, again, it's all new and off the cuff, but it's a pretty easy solution to provide a bump out, typical to what we see in traffic control on the public streets. We could see bump outs, we could see some other kinds of treatments. And might I suggest that we focus on that minimum or the standard driveway width of 24 feet? Would that be something that we could work with?
Yeah.
Internally,
Yeah.
And
I
then-
think that's worth looking at, and we have time to do it, so.
Okay.
Because that is separate and distinct from the curb cut
Right.
River Road Inn, Lock
Yeah,
Haven
that's-
Inn.
Yeah, the street standards are not under our purview here.
Okay.
They're not part of the development code. But certainly these internal circulation things, and of course, the caveat that we don't want to include fire lanes as part of this overall calculation. But even then, we would want pedestrian crossings to be demarcated and clearly delineated for traffic. You know, you drive in front of Lowe's and there's all kinds of stuff going on.
Yeah.
And that's, they have a full 10-foot lane, fire lane, which is right in front of it. They're not supposed to be storing stuff. And not my deal, I'm just saying.
Okay, thank you.
Is that, okay?
Yes.
Okay, Shane,
Okay.
thank you.
Okay, so then when we get into pages, page 5, we get into where we're talking about building facades. And we add a couple, we are proposing to add, excuse me, I haven't done it yet, and we're proposing it to you. We're adding some language here and eliminating some language. The language we're eliminating where it talks about the 300 feet and the 400 feet in the bottom of A and C, those are, it's kind of redundant language. It already lives in the other section of the code. And where we're adding the word horizontally, and we're adding no more than 15 feet between vertical design elements such as columns, pilasters, or patterns. This, basically with our design standards, puts every building in Keizer that's of a commercial nature in the CM, CR, and MU zones on more of an even keel with some of the design standard elements that we applied in Keizer Station. So that we end up with, instead of having a big blank wall of nothing, you have some sort of a vertical element that goes up. So it's strictly for building design and to, we feel, make it more consistent with what we've seen being built for the most part and what has been built in other parts of town. So that's where the adding the 15 feet.
Can we move down, Shane, to number 3, awnings?
Yes.
Which is just below that?
Just about, yeah.
Go ahead, go ahead.
Yeah, so with the awnings, some clarifying information about what awnings are, and then a strikeout for some of the prohibited materials for awnings. The strikeout may or may not be based on some testimony received at a council meeting with a certain unnamed business whose awning design would technically have been caught by that material issue. So that's kind of, that may or may not be why the awning language is added on here. And then also kind of clarifying what and where awnings are so that somebody can't just slap anything alongside a building and call it an awning.
Okay. My question here is, at the beginning of this, the strikeout is, you know, it's awnings dash awnings or canopies, and the canopies are strikeout. And then you go down to, I think it's the 4th sentence. Again, we're back to awnings and canopies. Is that just
I missed that one.
Should that have been knocked down?
We would propose, that was, I missed the second canopies.
Okay.
Yeah, it's
And
on the
third-
second
yeah,
page,
yeah.
on the next page.
I blame Nate, it's Nate's fault.
Yeah, the last sentence, because that's the,
Control F, find and replace.
All right, yeah, full disclosure, the and canopies was Nate's strikeout, and his point was, hey, we're trying to simplify some of this. What's really the difference between an awning and a canopy? And so we struck it.
So-
I didn't strike out the other two, but
Okay.
I can do that, for
Okay.
sure. Thank you, Gary.
yep.
It is my fault.
Okay, any more questions on the awnings? Are we good? Okay, so then under number 4, materials and textures with building materials, basically we did some strikeout, did some rewrite, added a little language. Ultimately, the attempt there is to simplify and combine the standards. There is some major redundancy in 1 and the original 1 and 2 where we said materials that are allowed are this, and then we said in the EG zone, and then the same exact list of materials with an added couple materials. And I think what happened is when Keizer Station was adopted way back when, 2004 was when this was last amended, the EG zone. I think we wholesale took a bunch of language from Keizer Station and the new EG zone that was created in 2004 and plugged it in kind of in a plug and play method, probably for expediency and to make sure nothing got missed. But in looking at it, I don't know why we would need to say in 1 and 2 that anywhere in town, brick, stone, stucco, yada yada are allowed, and then in the EG zone, the same things are allowed. If it's allowed, and it just needs to be the same list. So that's kind of what we were proposing there. Excuse me. And then there's a little add of a minimum of 2 separate and distinct building materials must be used. And that is something that we just feel is appropriate for having some variation instead of just a blank building of all one type of material. So we are proposing that. And then where we talk about the metal siding, we struck the word corrugated, added a little language to talk about design, but also we don't want it to be this big predominant material. And it's kind of in a response where design, it seems to be constantly shifting. Certain things are really popular for a while, and then other things are not as popular, and then new things are popular. And some of the design standards we had really prohibited some of the things that we're seeing in the market that builders want to do with new metal, and it's frankly, it looks really nice. It's pretty cool. So we're trying to change the language to give ourselves a little more flexibility to stay with the times as we move forward. So that's what those changes are attempting to do. Yes, sir.
So 2 separate and distinct building materials, so they could go all stucco and glass and you're good to go.
No.
Well, it
That
depends how,
wasn't intended.
it depends how they use the glass. So something other than a window
Okay.
or a door.
Okay, got it.
2 questions. Would it be easier to say what you don't want rather than what you would allow in the building materials?
Well, not off the top of my head, it would not be, no. But that is, I mean, that's something we could look into.
With that, what I'm thinking there is then that may allow for a little more flexibility, like you're saying, with changing styles over time. Whereas something that maybe, you don't want a Quonset hut on River Road, but
Well, but then we have to define Quonset hut. And
that's, yeah.
that's what I'm wrestling
And-
with. And part of my response to that question is, for so long, the development code has been fairly restrictive, and we are now saying we are giving more flexibility in these kinds of materials. I'm just thinking, for the professionals out there that have been used to dealing with our code, this might be an easier way to say, look, we're giving you more flexibility in materials. My concern is if we don't want a Quonset hut, we don't want just a corrugated metal building, those kinds of things. But I think that list might grow longer and would require a different kind of structure than what the code is. That's my preliminary response as to, I think I would rather stick with saying, look, we now have more flexibility in this list, which you're all used to, kind of thing.
Okay. My other question was some of the things I was seeing when I was researching like this stuff. Some codes were saying that having like a heavier materials at the base, and then as a building goes up, you go to lighter. Is that something we could consider?
Well, again, our code is fairly simple. I'm not saying that in a bad way, but we don't have architects on staff. We have minimal staff and minimal ability to try and enforce whatever we come up with. So we tend to try and say, let's keep it simple, and then we'll work with people within the authority that we have been given. To develop, I would love, deeply love, to be able to say we have a much more elaborate design review process and but I'm not sure we will have the resources to enforce and to evaluate and to process an elaborate design structure that actually gets into design principles and balance and symmetry and whatever else we would want to come up with. So I think I would prefer to keep it as simple as we have done in the past, which I understand. I completely understand.
So how do you deal with something that on the face of it when it comes in the door just isn't what you were looking for, but you're not explicitly precluding it? I'm sure you've had that.
We have, and we have actually been very successful, and I could think of a couple of examples. We were not successful in Wehrmart, but generally we're pretty successful in saying, you know, you're part of the community, we have a design standard. People generally respond positively to that kind of approach. Now we have some glaring examples of forget it kind of thing.
Does 231507, where it talks about the zoning administrator or designee, give some of that? It's page 10, Mike. Determination of conformance, because it says the zoning administrator or designee during the normal course of reviewing a building permit application shall conduct a concurrent development review as part of the review to determine a determination of the proposal's conformance with the provisions. Does that give some ability there to address your concern?
Well, and honestly, that's what we do use. We rely on that section to say, look, we've got to say this is substantially conforming to our standards. Push comes to shove, though, and people that really get into it and know what the, such as the example I just cited, and they absolutely refuse, that kind of that's not an ultimate backstop, you know. We lose some of those.
And I was just going to make that point.
Yeah.
There's only so many, there's a lot of gaps in the teeth here for that sort of thing. So something that we might not prefer can still make it through.
Yeah, and I think, Michael, what you're kind of getting at, or what I'm hearing at least, is more of kind of a philosophy, an approach to how much design requirement is enough, right? I mean, how restrictive do we want to be? Because clearly, right now, what you have in front of us, it's some tweaks to what we've had in the past, what we've applied, and what has ultimately created what Keizer kind of looks like today after 1998 when this development code was adopted. So buildings built prior to that, don't look at those, but the newer buildings that were built generally have been consistent with these development and design standards. One of the reasons Area B was so hard is I've worked here for literally 20 years, in the planning department for like 15, and I didn't know the last time a alternate had ever been done, because people generally comply with our standards. But clearly the standards, as you read through this section, they aren't a huge, robust set of standards. A lot of cities that will have a lot of master planned areas, or they'll have a downtown district and they'll have this and that, they'll have architectural review committees, and they won't have clear and objective standards. They will literally be like, hey, you come to our committee, you get its blessing, you provide them what they want, and it's, here we're talking about a very clear and objective set of standards that says, if you bring in a building to me in the CMCR MU zone and you provide an offset or a variation every 30 feet and you provide me some vertical elements and you provide me multiple materials and textures, you provide the appropriate ground floor windows and the driveway crossings and pedestrian connections, I am obliged to approve your building permit as compliant with that. But I think, what I'm hearing is you are kind of questioning whether or not we should really ramp up these standards to another level. Is that what I'm hearing?
Well, yeah, I don't think it would be a bad thing to have some improvement. However, I don't want to have the bring me a rock and I'll tell you which rock it is when you finally bring it to me.
Sure.
So when I was thinking about having that, kind of gradation of material heft, at least visual heft, it just, seems like a common way of requiring buildings to appear.
Part of my thought process right now is I've been in this business long enough to know that design standards change and ledger stone used to be really cool, and we wanted everybody to include ledger stone, the stacked rock and stuff. Well, now, that's not so cool.
Right.
And my only response is I would like to be able to be responsive to design themes and tastes of the day. So I like being able to have more authority in the zoning administrator, what Gary was referring to. But it's a balance.
No one saw that.
That was you. I was pointing at you.
Okay, that's fine.
Okay.
Blair, did you have something you want to comment on?
So under the determination of conformance then, with the materials in 4A, which are sort of these are the ones you should use, and 4A4, these are the ones you can't use. Within the 1 through 3, though, you have some latitude in the determination of conformance. If they come forward with a brand new material that's never been used in Keizer, or some new, we're seeing a lot of recycled plastics and things that are being used to build things. You have latitude within this then to go ahead and allow that, or do we need to build that latitude in so that if, this gets approved by city council in 3.5 months, and then 4 months, the best material that's ever come out, cost effective and everything, and now we're not allowed to use it because it's not in our code.
Right. So I think that depends on which guy you ask that's sitting over here. I think if you ask the community development staff, we would say, yes, we believe that we are building in some flexibility to make a determination of substantial conformance like we would with anything. We have to always be really careful with how far we go with that because of the guy at the very end of the table that would say, hey, watch yourself, don't get out of line. And I think I would point back to, I think that if somebody were to come in, Matt, like you said, that it was truly something we had never seen in Keizer. It was very different, and it didn't, so for example, if somebody were to come in with that type of a material, and it were made to look and resemble a classic material that's in the list,
Right.
Historically, Nate, as the zoning administrator, would have the power to make that interpretation and just make that interpretation. Now, if something was very new and different, I would, as the staff person, point them to say, hey, this is a perfect opportunity to do a alternative design standard. Let's go to planning commission. And so then, because it's still, there's still a way through that process, it just means you got to go and have a public hearing and do a little show and tell with a governing body that has the ability to make some decisions that I, as a staff person, really has to be bound to the black and white. You guys have a little more flexibility. So I think if it was something really, truly different and new, I, as a staff person, would probably want that to come to you guys to say, hey, do you think this is good for our community anyhow?
So the new flexibility generally gets in there anyways. Anything beyond the flexibility and sort of what's written here would need to come back and go through the alternatives process.
Yeah.
I mean, you do have precluded, as Mike had brought up, there are some precluded materials, but it's not exhaustive.
Right.
And obviously, if you guys are recognizing something that's outside of the scope of what's cool, to use Nate's words, then we would take that into consideration as part of the conformance.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I have a question for staff. Number 3, the metal siding. Not that you see and Kyle, you can speak to this. I mean, there was a time we had aluminum siding, that was great until the kids' baseball hit it and it's dented for life. You know, and there's been vinyl siding, everything kind of cycles through. There's not, to my knowledge, a lot of metal siding in the residential or duplex, triplex type stuff now. Do you see any of that, Kyle?
No, there's not. Roofing, there's a lot of, but not siding.
Okay. But, and I don't know if it would ever become cost competitive with what builders and developers are using now. But in here, you say, metal siding other than blah, 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 shall not be the predominant material used. Metal siding is not allowed for residential buildings housing 3 or more dwellings. So if you had a triplex, a sixplex, a 50-unit multifamily, and there was a good metal siding product that, for whatever reason, the developer felt it was a cost-effective way to put together, he would be precluded from using that?
Currently, yes, because we're not aware of a product that
Okay.
is suitable for that. Again, that alternative design standard would, if there is a new product that hits the market.
Okay,
We would say, no, you know.
okay. All right. I just wanted to make sure that, you know, we weren't locking something that's gonna, but if you have within the zoning administrator's power, if you would.
So the intent here is that we don't want people using standing seam metal roofing
Yeah.
for building siding. And that's been a prohibition for a long time. And again, we're not aware of any product that would be suitable.
There is a commercial non-standing seam siding that it's basically standing seam with the seams inverted, but it's so expensive nobody would use it on a residential application, and it's only used really in trim applications
Yeah, see,
on commercial
trim
buildings.
is fine.
Right.
So.
But I mean smaller sections like
Right.
a detail or something.
All right.
I have one more question. So what about when the occasional house you see in permanent construction that has had plywood walls, exterior walls for a couple of years? And that's not the design, but
Is it a single-family dwelling, Michael?
yeah.
So single-family dwelling isn't going to be subject to these standards
Okay.
in 2.315 at all. It only captures commercial and multifamily.
True, yeah.
So
Okay.
now, there'd be some other issues if it's sitting around like that, like maybe needing to recite it, but.
Okay.
So, yeah. Okay. Are you guys okay with that? The language for the multifamily? I mean, we just basically reworded that. It's always been excluded for multifamily. We just wrote it where we felt like it read better. Okay. So the next, other than the surprises for me, page 7, we talk about color. This is one that, the color code. So we are proposing a change, which Shannon may or may not like the language to. Exactly. I think he was pushing that we might have to tweak it a little bit. We had looked at a few different cities' color codes, and there's a bunch of different versions out there. The language that you see in front of you in 5A1 was lifted, I think, verbatim. I'm pretty sure it was exactly word for word of what McMinnville talked about as far as using. I liked the fact that another city kept some more general terms for colors. Previously, we've had this red, green, blue factor and this each component factor with percentages, and it's the XYZ and the RGB. And people come in and they say, what can I paint my commercial building? And I do not know what to tell them. And I said, well, how about you bring me the color? And it's like what you said earlier. I want you to bring me that rock. I'll tell you which one it is when you bring it to me. And that's what we felt like with color. So we wanted to do something that was more simple, not just for us, but also for our business community, because we have historically cut out some colors that are nice colors They aren't gaudy, they're not awful, they're not super bright or horrible, but because of these XYZ and RGB numbers, they don't fit in the gamut of what we could allow. So we're proposing some language that basically says we still want neutral colors, we still don't want crazy things, and we're going to hold you to the LRV, which measures the light reflectance, so it's the light reflectance value, and that's a number that any paint provider can give us because it sits right on the back side of the paint chip. So it's a quantified number, and it basically measures how bright that color will appear to our eyes. So we wanted to stick with that standard, and we felt like it's a better way to go. So that's what we're doing, or that's what we're proposing with color. And if you have any other questions on it, just, let me know. And if not, and you love it, then we'll move very quickly on to the next things.
It's about time. Move on, please.
Oh, go ahead, Michael.
Typo, you have the finish shall either be matte or satin, and it should be MATTE.
Oh, thank you.
Unless you want everything to look like
Flannel.
matte.
Oh. Hey, that's one I didn't even change, too. Thank you. That's a typo that's lived since 2004. Amazing. In under number 3, right? Michael, that's the one?
Yep.
The finish. Thank you. Okay, so page 8, we're back to this little guy that I handed out earlier. Because we had added the word commercial in exemptions, we were going to add the 500 square feet in area or larger to this. And literally, it was one of those things that Shannon had caught it and said, hey, Shane, you changed it here in exemptions. You need to change it elsewhere. And I was like, oh, thank you. I plugged it in. And then, like I said, I went back and I read it later. And I went, wait, no, I don't want to add that there. I don't want it to say that. Because there's no trash enclosures that are more than 500 square feet, almost ever. But I still want them to match the building, though. So that's why that's why I'm proposing that we would strike out the 500 square feet or larger, because it's just unnecessary. Yeah, on your handout sheet. And then in one underneath it, we got rid of that second set of words because it was just frankly unnecessary. It kind of created an ambiguity within the own standard. It was odd how it was written. So that's why I struck that out. And then D, the alternative design solutions. This was a paragraph that's lived in there since 2004 again. It really has no purpose since we talk about it at the beginning of the chapter as well as the end of the chapter outlining the process that you go through for alternative design solutions. So it just was straight up redundant. And so we're moving to strike that paragraph wholesale. Good? All right. Okay, page 9 and 10, and we're done. We're almost there. So in page 9, we get into the multifamily design. And so the changes that we're proposing here, well, just a tiny history lesson. The multifamily design standards, they came when we eliminated infill standards. So in 2015, we got rid of our infill standards section as a standalone section that only applied to certain property types. And we said, okay, if these design standards are good for these areas in town, they should be good for everywhere in town. So those standards got picked up, and again, they got picked up and got plugged into here as a place to live back in 2015. That was before my time of coming to these meetings, but I do remember that that's what happened to them because they went away from section 2.316. So when we were reviewing this and looking at it, we said, hey, we don't really want only these things to apply to multifamily developments if they're within 50 feet of, single-family residential construction. We want our apartment complexes to look nice wherever they're at. So the language we're proposing is attempting to say, essentially, if you have an apartment complex or a multifamily development and you're building it adjacent to a street or another common property line, we want there to be some design vernacular to your buildings and not just giant square boxes with one single plane. We want there to be some variation and the things that apply to that. So that's really all we're intending to do with the language change in F. And then in D, 2D, where we talk about the building planes, that shows as a strikeout, but it really is a move. we're defining building plane and moving that exact language verbatim. We're moving that to definitions. So it's not going away, we're just putting it in a different place because that's how our code is structured. And then the last little bit in 07 and 08, which Gary, you had alluded to 07. Oh, Michael, yes?
So, one thing I would like to see, and this is broadly, is multifamily units having, at least the ones along the street, to actually face the street. Is there something in here that we can at least, not necessarily address the requirement that you have to face the street, but if you do face the street as your primary entrance, it should look like this and you can allow certain things? Or do you feel like what's written as is does that?
While Shane's pondering that, I want some clarification. Are you suggesting, when you say face the street, you're talking about the entrances to the apartments should be on the street and the parking behind?
Yeah, or if you have, say, like near where I live, the Harmony crossing, I think it's called, apartments, where you have everything is geared towards internal, but there are units that are on the street, but the backs to the street. So at least some of those, the ones that are adjacent to the street would face the street.
Or could they have aesthetics that give them something other than, this is the back wall of an apartment?
And these are
And
the
seeing
back
that's,
balcony or
so
something.
that's the standards that we've tried to modify and strengthen here, is that there are design standards for multifamily. As far as the entrance goes, I understand what you're talking about, walk-up apartments, those sort of things, but generally you see those in much denser urban environments. Here, we typically are, I know you're going to hate this and you probably shoot me, but we are auto-oriented. And so people would literally have to park behind the building and then walk around the building to get into it. Would be, I think that would be difficult, and I think it'd be untenable for builders to create an environment like that. And until we have more of those urban facilities, like a robust transit facility or different kinds of transportation options, I would be reluctant to say, let's adopt that as a requirement.
Right, and I'm not saying at this point making that the requirement. I just want to make sure if somebody does choose to do that, that there are some guidelines as to how that would look, rather than, just another blank.
Well, there's nothing that would prevent them from doing it now. The offset requirements and those kinds of design things, they would easily accommodate the entrance on the street. So there's nothing that would prohibit a builder from choosing to do that, if that's what I'm...
Yeah, and I don't know if it even prohibits. It's more of a design thing. If they do choose it, just making sure that the design is something that is appealing to the people on the street.
Well, again, that's why we're trying to make these standards more broadly applicable to multifamily. So it doesn't matter if you're adjacent to a home or strictly speaking on a street frontage, that these kinds of building plane differentiations and kinds of things, we're trying to say that needs to apply more broadly than what it does today.
Yeah.
So I do not envision that, certainly it doesn't provide, I think maybe you're trying to say maybe there needs to be an incentive for creating that, or the current structure does not provide any sort of incentive. The current structure just says you've got to have design articulation in your buildings, which can easily accommodate a street-oriented frontage.
So, if I may, is your concern the Harmony Crossing example where it's the back of the building facing the street?
Well, certainly in the broader scale, I'd like to see those things reversed. But in the short term, like if someone did try to reverse that on their own, to have it again. an
Yeah, see, I think it
appealing-
applies now, because it doesn't say that the entrances face the street. It says the buildings face the street, so I think that we would interpret the Harmony Crossing apartments, for you who don't know, is off trail, and they're right up against trail, unlike a lot of apartments, and the back of the apartments, so the balcony, if you will, faces on trail.
Right.
You don't see that often. To me, the way that reads is building planes for multifamily dwellings facing the property lines or the street. It doesn't say the entrances. I would interpret that to mean either side of the building. The only reason it's worded like that is if it's such a large complex that there's internal buildings. So there's a building that doesn't face a property line or a street directly because there's another building, then it doesn't apply to those. That's the intent, as I understand it.
Yep, that is. And I mean, and really, this is a standard that really, I mean, it really speaks. And Michael, I get where you're going. I mean, as far as the design standard element goes, and we do have some design standards within the individual zones, and then this though is really more about just strict like massing, and so it's really just about having projections or a plane and then a plane, and that can only be of a certain size. So if you had a very tall apartment complex, then you'd have to have some offsets this way also, right? I mean, because it's actually capping out the overall area, 1,400 square feet, 960 square feet, things like that. But I do think that if, I mean, we don't really speak to requiring building orientation to be a certain way currently.
Right.
But I mean, if that's something that the Planning Commission wants to do, that's obviously something that can be looked at.
Well, and like I said, I think that's a bigger conversation because it's not just apartment buildings.
Sure.
It's all buildings. But, if that breakup of plane and all that would cover however the building is oriented.
Yeah. I mean, and it would. I mean, so that would be the same thing if your front door was out there. We'd still want to have that articulation and building massing that had varied pieces, so it wasn't just a big blank wall with a front door either.
Right.
So, okay.
Mr.
So
Lair?
I just have 2 quick points. F1A reads, no building plane exceed 960. I think you want shall or some sort of language there.
Thank you.
The other thing, and I guess this is maybe a little bit philosophical, but when we say multifamily structures shall create a form and scale to provide interest and aesthetic appeal, I think we need to be cautious and mindful of what that does, which is make things cost a lot more. And if we're going to take into consideration, what do they call that? Low-income housing and the development of new low-income housing, the project costs are going to go up, and I think it's going to potentially take a project outside the scale of what would be normally considered affordable. So I would just suggest that as a cautionary tale and look at that as appropriately as possible to try to not put a standard on something just for the sake of our eyes, especially when we talk about multifamily, which typically can be more acceptable to low-income housing. So just a cautionary tale. I don't want to. Great, it's pretty, but I can't afford to live there kind of scenario.
Go ahead and answer, or give your response. And I have another comment.
My response, it's a delicate balance because you're creating a standard as to what you want your community to look like. Nor do we want simply the cheapest construction imaginable as a standard that anybody can put, regardless of whether, because we have no control over the market and what a builder may choose to develop as low income or rent as low income. We have no controls that way. Right. Legally, we don't. So just say I understand the cautionary tale. I feel it as well. But there are also all kinds of factors that play in here. And these are not, if you'll in the big scheme of the world, going back to, you know, an architectural review committee, these are pretty basic standards. So
Well, even just breaking up the plans, I think is probably appropriate. And like Mike said, with a lot of this, and I think that, you know, that might cover it, but,
understand. The one sentence you're saying is,
it's just one of those things, you get your nose a little bit up in the air, and it's gonna make this tough, I think, for some folks to wanna look at, how those things kinda fold out, so.
understood.
I personally think that what we're asking for here can be achieved without ramping up the cost of a product significantly. And unless we move to even a more socialistic manner, when we have people working for profit in our society, you know, we have to give them the incentive to make their living, because that's how the builders and developers are, you know, that's how they make their living. And it's not rape and pillage, it's a return on their investment. So I think we need to find the balance there, and I think that what staff has come up with here, the builder or developer can achieve without adding a significant amount of money to their product.
I would just add, I mean, that it's interesting, the affordable housing conversation. I've looked at a few different cities where, you know, there was a House bill that was passed that covered things like cities having to allow for ADUs if you're over a certain size, accessory dwelling units, sorry. And with that bill, there was some language specifically in there about timeliness of processing applications for affordable housing projects and different things like that. We're planning on bringing ADUs to you guys in October to talk about those and to clarify some language just to be consistent with that bill that was passed for just definitions. But I think what I would say to that, Matt, is I totally appreciate your input on that. It might be something that maybe should be revisited at a later time. If the city as a whole says, hey, we want to move a certain direction in the affordable housing world, that maybe that would be a perfect example of, hey, affordable housing projects, and it could be done administratively. So an affordable housing project could come in, and we as staff, if we know that that's something that is in the interest of the council and the policies, we would say to them, hey, you're an affordable housing project, you should come in for an alternative design review. So that, I mean, I think that would be a good, because I can see that if somebody came and said, hey, you're killing me, and, you know, I can't build this thing and I can't provide housing, I think that would be a great reason to point them in that direction. So.
And I would imagine if we, as a community, we really get involved in affordable housing issues, that there'll be a whole set of new standards that would be created that we would tie into these existing standards.
Yeah, again, I'm not questioning the language. It was just one of those things that crept up, and I went, you know, but I agree with what Gary said. I mean, the market's going to drive what the market's going to drive, and I think the language you got here is not so prescriptive or restrictive that I don't think it's going to create any issues. I just wanted to, you know, bring it up for the sake of bringing it up, you know, because they actually, the city to the south just did a really nice project over off Portland Road, and it's very nice, it's very attractive, and it is sort of an affordable living type situation, and so maybe that's a good thing to look at. I don't know, but
Sure. Okay, so our last two little sections, 2.31507 and 08, essentially, again, it just kind of buttons it up, clarifies the process. It clarifies that we do development review concurrent with a building permit for anything that meets with the standards. Anything outside of that, you have to do the development standards alternative process. And then again, we added the language that these are going to be heard by the Planning Commission, unless it's in Keizer Station, in which case it would go straight to council, because they would have been the ones that had approved the master plan, and that's what it says in the Keizer Station plan. So, so with that, I'm done talking, unless you have other questions of me. I wasn't planning on walking through all the other sections, but if you have questions on them, I'm happy to answer them.
We have further questions or concerns for staff regarding this? Okay. Having none, can we close the public hearing? and a motion to whatever we're going to do. Okay. With that, I'll close the public hearing.
And I would make a motion to forward the recommendation of the planning commission to the city council as amended to allow staff to make corrections.
I'll second.
Okay, we have a first and a second, and call for the vote. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? And one absent. Okay, well, that was fairly painless and moved right along. I appreciate everybody's contributions on that. New and old business.
That's me. Before we leave, I just want a little clarification on corrections in the motion.
Talking the canopy strikeout.
The canopy strikeout, adding
spell
shall.
Smell mat correctly.
There's
That'd be good.
Scrivener errors or however you want to
Yeah,
call it.
yeah,
okay.
okay. And
And- Oh, go.
no, go ahead.
No, I'm just writing. I'm writing. Go ahead, keep talking.
The driveway aisle issue.
24 feet.
I don't.
I was unclear. It was not part of the motion, but I was unclear as part of the discussion as to what staff's assignment was in that particular issue. The pedestrian crossing of driveway.
Well, in my motion, I understood that we weren't touching that
Okay.
issue. So
Okay.
if we need to readdress that, then I suppose I don't know how we would go through that process if I needed with.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure what was included in the corrections part.
I mean, that was just when I made the motion. That's how I understood it. I didn't understand that we had, because Gary had asked for a straw poll on whether or not we were going to take that forward, but I don't think that was ever
I
done.
didn't
so.
have any sense that
Okay,
the majority
okay.
of the board wants to do that, so we'll move ahead.
Oh, yeah. So the updates basically is grants. Our education outreach grant. We are working with the consultant to actually bring that. We have not actually decided on a date because we're trying to sandwich it before we get into the holidays. But in between the other processes, which we are in our Keizer revitalization grant, we expect we're having an all consultant, all staff meeting that I think is going to be on the 26th of this month to actually pin down the calendar and how we're going to get the education outreach, how we're going to get these things completed. Sorry, should complete my sentence. So I don't have those dates yet, which they will be coming back as part of, we have one less public engagement open house forum that will be part of our revitalization project, which hopefully we can synthesize all the input that we've had, and we will then have another public outreach meeting. Then it will come back to the council and planning commission for another work session similar to what you did last month. One other crazy thing that I've had a leave of my census and decided that we should apply for a federal grant to establish a quiet zone on the railroad crossing at Shamawa. And so I'm in the middle of learning the federal lingo and terms and acronyms. And it's a little daunting, but we're making headway. And that grant is actually due on the 18th, next week, 17th. Yeah.
What does a quiet zone look like?
A lot of signs is what it looks like with pedestrian flashing lights and tied into the controller. It looks like $200,000 worth of work is what it looks like.
We're
So-
talking Lock Haven here where you go past
Lock
Keizer
Haven,
Center?
Yeah.
Okay.
So right through the middle of Keizer Station, The new apartments that are built there, I grant, they're brand new. The railroad has been there forever. The crossing has been there forever. Those apartments are brand new, so, buyer beware kind of thing. The reality is, we live in such constrained land situation, we don't have many choices as to where we're going to put our higher density housing. And the railroad is an important asset and part of the vital infrastructure of a community. We understand that, but we all need to live together nicely. I'm practicing what I'm going to write here. Anyway, so a quiet zone would simply allow them to make the crossing without the obligatory warning horn. Now, if there's something on the tracks, they will obviously still blow their horns, that sort of thing. But it would make the quality of life a little better for a lot of new citizens to our community. So we're working on that and working hard to get that submitted in a very short time frame. That's
Anything else from staff? Okay. Anything up here that anybody like to touch on, cover? Okay. Who is Council Liason? No. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, that's what I was asking. I didn't, saw you and didn't see you, Kim.
That's okay. It's all right. It's good to be seen or not seen. It could be either way, right? It's going to be a busy day tomorrow at City Hall. I think 4 o'clock starts stormwater meeting from 4 to 6, and at 6 o'clock is the traffic, bikeways, pedestrian meeting, and then at 7 o'clock is the West Keizer Neighborhood Association meeting, and we have 2 speakers tomorrow, and they are, it's on recycling, which Reed Carlson is the Marketing and Recycling Coordinator from Marion County Environmental Services. And then Keizer Fire Chief Jeff Cowan will be there to speak about the levy that will be on the November ballot. And then we always have a quarterly visit from Eric Bandonis, who is the Parole and Probation Officer for Marion County. So that's on the agenda for tomorrow night at the West Keizer, 7 o'clock here. And then we still have several openings for volunteers on other committees in the community, and these are due, Debbie, correct me if I'm wrong, but they're due on the 26th of September? Yes, and our meeting for that is October 4th. We've moved it around due to some meetings. But we have openings on the Keizer Points of Interest, Public Arts Commission, Planning Commission, Parks Board, and Traffic, Bikeways, Pedestrian. And we're also recruiting for youth liaison for some other committees. And I have, I have them, thank you to Debbie, little flyers. So if you have the opportunity to take any of these and distribute them, I would appreciate it. That's all I have. Yes? Yeah.
Okay, one of the things that I was thinking of in terms of youth liaisons is to get people that are already known to the various committees. So if any of you know any youth that would like to be liaisons on the Planning Commission, for instance, it's just easier for kids to go and be the only kid where they know at least one person. So whether they're, kids from, wherever, whatever context, if you would let me know and I can contact them because they're probably McNair kids or whatever. And if they're not, I'm still willing to contact them. But yeah, I'm just going to try that approach as far as the youth recruitment.
Okay. Counselor Reed, are these students generally juniors or seniors or just seniors, or is there a?
They're both, and they're mostly juniors and seniors. I don't think there's a strictly requirement that they're a junior, senior, that they're just a high school student.
Okay. All right.
And one thing that we notice about seniors is once they get it on their resume, sometimes they're not real dedicated. And so sometimes, and I have seen some very, very impressive sophomores, and we've even talked about the possibility of extending this down to the middle schools where they have very intensive community service programs. Generally speaking, they have been juniors and seniors, but it's not limited to that.
Okay. And it's not limited to just McNary High School
No,
students.
absolutely not.
Keizer High School resident, correct?
Yes, so even homeschooled or private schools or McNary, I just happen to shoot at McNary because that's where I am. And but yeah, in any high school age student would be qualified for this. And just to mention, the applications for both the youth and any other departments are online and can be found online. So
Good, thank you.
thank you.
Thank you, Laura.
I had a quick question for Kim. Kim, the recycling talk, that's not what the chamber's doing, that's a separate one?
Right, the chamber is a separate one, and I believe that's also on the 26th for some reason, I'm thinking. So let me look right here.
I
I
was
can
trying
tell
to
you.
find.
Yeah, there is a community conversation on September 26th here at City Hall with the chamber, and that's also in reference to recycling.
Okay,
So,
thank you.
thank you, Michael, for the clarification, too. So lots of recycling discussion this month.
Anything else? Counselor Freeman? Okay. Who is the council representative for September?
Supposed to be Hirsch, but I knew he wasn't going to be here, so I am looking for volunteers.
Michael?
Yeah.
Sold. Okay, let's see. Is this, Josh, is this your last official meeting, or does he come to October meeting? How's that working?
He will be done.
Okay. Well, for those of you that don't know, this is Josh's the end of his term, and he's opted not to renew. So we thank you for your service to our community, and wish you well, and hope we'll see you raising your hand to do something else to make this a better place.
When the kids are a little bit older.
Yeah, understandable. Okay, is there anything else to come before the board? Planning Commission. With that, we are adjourned.